Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology Debunking Mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which is science of fake lie imagination or study of fake lie or imagination. Well, all ancient prehistory is called term mythology for many reasons. It's a scholarly convenience and maybe the scholarly articulation. I do not know, but it's all termed as mythology. But when we talk about Sattology, it means verifiable archaeological astronomical proofs. I have a very, very special guest today. He has come on this show many times. And let us welcome Mr. Carpentier from
Regards,
Paris,
greetings to all.
outskirts of Paris, from the outskirts of Paris. Uh, like we see so many media narratives, and a lot of students are there, and we none of us watch the mainstream news nowadays, and mostly we are tired of news. Generally it's always a sad news. So when we talk about the journalistic standards, like one of the people he quoted to me, I only read news with journalistic golden standards. And then I was scratching my head that where are the golden standards today of journalism? Like, I mean, a verifiable criticism is not there. So what do you have to say on that?
Hello again. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
So, as far as journalistic standards are concerned, I think that we have both a curse and a blessing in social media because we are able to find so many channels, so many messages, and so many interpretations of what we're interested in that we obviously have a much more varied and confusing but also enriching picture than we used to until some years ago when we had only a few major media which are commercially owned and which therefore present generally an image which is crafted for us by certain interest groups. Obviously, it's difficult to see everything. It's impossible to see everything and to get too many different versions of what's going on. I have a scientist friend in France who says there are two things, information and exformation. Information, by definition, when there is too much of it, it's impossible to draw any conclusions. It's like lawyers saying, on the other hand, there is always another hand. And these are not just two hands, these are manifold hands, 1,000 hands. So in the end, information can become paralyzing. On the other hand, once you abstract on the basis of good sense and some knowledge, what information you can process, you can get out exformation, which essentially is a distillation, a synthesis of what seems to be, according to, of course, your own subjective perspective, what is important and what's valuable. Now, we all know that any event and any reality has many layers of interpretation contained within it. So we cannot expect to get the final picture on anything, but we can at least get closer to it. And that helps because after all, our life is not based on certainties and on omniscience. Our lives are based on approximations and on adjustments.
When we talk about great opening lines, and when we talk about the American media and also the British media, BBC, and their image around the world, you travel across the world, you travel to many countries, and obviously French and the British and US have always been on the opposite sides. Other than World War II, mostly they have been on the opposite sides, on diplomacy front only, but when it comes to war, they are all together. So when we talk about media image of the American media across the world, what do you think of it? And then we'll touch base on other media houses.
Well, American media became purely commercial organs probably sooner than anywhere else. And everybody, I would say almost worldwide, has followed that path, except in some totalitarian states. Now, we all know that state media are generally no better than commercial media, except for the fact that they may have more general interest, at least within the national framework, than commercial media, which by definition pursue an agenda in the service of their commercial owners, of their sponsors. But as far as American media are concerned, I wouldn't say anything bad about them because, frankly, European media are generally no better. For example, American media, I remember when I lived in America, you kept hearing that all news are local and that nobody is interested in things that happen too far away, even though the world is now a small place. But the fact is that commercial media focuses on immediate surroundings, on what is really supposedly of concern to you because it's happening down the road. And in a way, that's very misleading because you tend to get a micro picture of what's happening. But again, media depend upon their consumers. So if you find there are few consumers for particular kinds of media, the media don't spend any interest, don't spend any attention, don't give any attention to certain things. India is a good example. You generally get very few news about India in the Western media. And if you do get news, they generally are negative because, again, people are only interested in what shocks. Maybe they are not interested only in what shocks, but that's what the media think they sell best. And therefore, that trend gets reinforced. In a way, it's a self-reinforcing loop, if you know what I mean.
So officially Russian-owned television called RT News is headquartered in Washington, D.C. in America. And then there are other Indian entities also coming in the US in a big way. Vion is one of the examples. American media is all over India, CNN 18, and I don't know how many channels they own. And American media giants, like the owners, are also in Europe as well, like the DFW channel, which is in Germany based entity media house. It's also partly owned by the Americans, partly. And I may be wrong if somebody is watching that, but this is my information on the Google search. Vanguard Corporation has stakes in most of the media corporations all over the world. So when we talk about one world view, practically media is doing it. So whatever the American media says, the same version comes out of BBC, which is the biggest, I would say, the news outlet owned by the government of Britain. And also it is the most, you can say, Americans don't like it, but the extreme leftist liberal view of everything. Liberal is not a bad word. Its connotations have become bad, and so what is your view on American corporations, large corporations owning most of the media houses, including social media?
Yes, there has been a process of concentration. There used to be several media houses until about perhaps 40, 50 years ago. And now there are only 5 big media which control, 5 big corporate groups which control most, I would say, major mainstream media in the world, and especially in the so-called Western world. The process of concentration is a natural one unless it is counteracted, unless it is balanced and moderated by either state influence or by international organizations, but that control is not there. So naturally, media become more and more concentrated in big capital. And you mentioned the Vanguard Group, but if you look at Vanguard, BlackRock, and another one, they practically now own a big part of the world's economy through all their cross-shareholdings and all. So you have this concentration not only in the media, but in the global economy. And people like, Edward Snowden, and our friend Assange have both been very, significant in terms of their showing this reality to people who might not have been aware of it until a few years ago.
So one of the problems in the global, it's mostly a satiristic comment also, that the global democracies, they're all going in one direction, and that is the direction of Twitter. Twitter has become the chosen communication medium of throughout the world, all over the world. And the new CEO is an Indian American guy. And the old CEO, Jack, is being now becoming a preacher, like a sermons. He gives sermons on media neutrality and human rights. So, how real are the human rights issues? I do not ever got the point that if some country has to be put sanctions on, suddenly they develop human rights, according to American State Department. What is your view on that?
Human rights is a very flexible and subjective concept, despite the appearances, simply because human rights have not been you might say, consistent concept for the last 200 years, since they became part of both the French and American official constitutions. In the sense that in the beginning, human rights were considered to be defined by social status, by the gender or the sex of the person. Men had more rights than women. White people had obviously a lot more rights than other ethnic groups. And likewise, rights were supposed to be essentially tied to first to birth, then more to economic status. From what we might call basic rights, we have gone into a number of other rights which are no longer restricted to individuals as they used to be, but are now applied to entire communities. So you have rights for certain minorities, and then it creates the problem. It raises the problem of are the rights of certain minorities to be greater than the rights of the so-called majority. And since the majority itself is divisible into infinite number of minorities, how many minorities are supposed to have exceptional rights? And if they don't, then how do you limit the rights of all those individuals and communities? In the end, inevitably, rights are impinging upon other rights. And that's where the famous statement comes that my right stops where the right of another one begins. But that itself is creating a huge number of controversies, because how can you decide at what point your right is to be limited? For example, nowadays, a lot of statements are no longer really tolerated in the media, in public discourse, because they are considered offensive. Now, the question is, how much can you have free speech if you can't offend anybody who might feel offended? You see, there is hardly any ability to decide on that. The whole concept becomes ideological. Some people say, oh, no, this you cannot say because that minority is highly sensitive and therefore it won't accept this sort of statement. Therefore, you should withdraw the statement or we will be punished for it. On the other hand, if you say certain things about other communities or perhaps other countries, then that's supposed to be fine because those countries are not supposed to be friendly countries. Therefore, you can say a lot, true or untrue, against the Russians and the Chinese in the West, and you probably will not be penalized. But on the other hand, if you say things about certain groups of people, that will be considered extremely offensive, and you will be regarded at that point as a very undeserving member of society and perhaps ostracized in some way. So all those realities are staring at us in the face, and nobody is able to tell us what exactly now is the law. I am also alluding to the current situation with regard to COVID. We are being told that we should all vaccinate as many times as they tell us because it's an act of social responsibility in order to protect others. However, we realize that the vaccines do not protect others. They can still get sick because we can still be contagious. Therefore, if we are not vaccinated according to the current, doxa, the current ruling opinion, then we are being, essentially we are hurting others or we may hurt others, and therefore we can be excluded from a number of places, which is now actively being done in both in America and in Europe. I think in Europe it's getting worse because at least the US has got states that are fighting back, but in Europe everybody seems to walk in lockstep more or less. So at that point, what can you say? That my right is no longer really a right as such because anybody else who finds that I am hurting them in some way can essentially abolish my right. So we have come to a sort of an end of the road as far as rights are concerned. And I think both philosophically and socially, we are going to have to really rethink these basic concepts of society because they are no longer working. Society is becoming simply unviable.
The French have created many interesting terms which the world is using all the time, the left and the right. And the world is, branding each other, that you are on the right wing or you're on the left wing. And the middle path is nobody talks about, where everyone is partially left and everyone is partially right also. If you are highly opinionated, you will be, no, if you look at the politics actually, especially in democracy, the left and right keep fluctuating. Anyone who supports the people in power is automatically the right, because that's what their supporters become. Actually, they're supporting the government. But the media was designed to be traditionally left, oppose everything or everyone in the government, or find out loopholes which can be brought to the people. Now, when the media takes sides between left and right, then the losers are the people, and the democracy gets weakened. What is your view on this?
Just like right and left are extremely subjective and disputable ways of describing reality. Reality can certainly not be cased into these boxes of either right or left, for the simple reason that both concepts have evolved dramatically. Generally, to be on the right signifies being conservative in the social, political, and economic sense. But then again, many people are on the right economically, and they are so on the left, or at least they think they are, as far as social values are concerned. And the opposite is true. I'll give you a good example with regard to the left in America today, which is quite often very comfortable with the social and economic inequality. They basically are asking for things like gender equality or LGBT rights or special rights for minorities. But otherwise, they are very reconciled with an increasingly economically unequal society. And in fact, some of the billionaires, especially the high-tech billionaires who have emerged in recent years, are generally very, I wouldn't say they would define themselves necessarily as leftists, but they certainly are quite comfortable with the so-called woke left. And many of them have an axe to grind against what they consider to be the Republican right. So if you want to make a more perhaps telling definition, to have a more telling definition, you might say that the more conservative and more individualistic people are perhaps more likely to be on the right. Individualistic in the sense that they do not want the government to control everything they do, and they regard the individual and the free association of individuals, beginning with the family, which is not always so free, but which is, no matter what we think, the basic cell of society, and then going on to societies and associations, etc., etc. On the other hand, the left tends to be much more collectivist and to be enamored of the idea of progress, and whatever sense that is taken, because progress actually can go in any direction. Progress means simply moving forward, but then forward in what direction? For example, a lot of progress today is taking place in the direction of automation and robotization, which means inevitably more and more people are losing their jobs and are no longer able to find any gainful employment. So that's not a leftist ideal by any means, because it deprives people of work and therefore of dignity and of the ability to support themselves. Yet it's progress because it's high-tech progress. So, again, once we try to define reality and break it up into these little pieces that are defined by old ideologies, which were themselves very conventional. We all know that the reason why the conservatives were normally associated with the right, while the progressives, the way they like to be called, the progressives are associated with the left, is simply because of a particular topographical arrangement in the original Constituent Assembly in France, in which the pro-monarchy and more, you might say, capitalistic bourgeois elements were on the right of the speaker, while the people who were more in favor of economic equality and social leveling were in fact on the left, but this was all fortuitous. And yet we have become prisoners of these concepts. And it's now difficult to have a conversation without referring to the right or left, however unsatisfactory and misleading these terms may be.
Moving to another topic, completely another topic. Now we are all going through pandemic, and recently French discovered another strand, IHU, and which is supposed to be more dangerous than Omicron. But if you look at the world media in unison, now this pandemic which is going on, Omicron, which has been the most widely infected, even though the effect may be minimal, but it has widely infected. But if you look at the global media narrative coming from WHO and everyone else, everyone is trying to minimize and trying to show that they are controlling better throughout the world. Some countries are really successful, but the US, the condition is very bad, very, very bad in terms of infections. Uh, so, but you don't see any media counters, nothing is there. No media counters, no media narrative, no media hype. But the numbers from the CDC, Center for Disease Control in the US, is alarming. So what is the plan? Like in Europe also, conditions are very bad in most of the country. In Italy is probably one of the worst affected even today. So what is the media hiding, or what is the media's role in this right now? Because it seems that economy is taking precedence over the health now.
Actually, all you hear is the opposite, that while, let's say, during the Spanish flu epidemic in 1919, 1920, the economy was king, and most of the Western economies were badly devastated by the war that had just ended. Therefore, the Spanish flu was downsized in public coverage, and focus was on people making a living and on rebuilding the national economies. Now they tell you proudly, we are not like we were at that time. We are not like in 1968, 69, when the Hong Kong flu made quite a few devastating inroads into the world. We say now we are giving priority to human life, and we are even willing to shut down the economy in order to save people. Now, this is, of course, quite disputable and probably misleading, because the fact is that there is a political agenda behind the policies adopted for COVID-19. We all know about the Great Reset now, mostly thanks to the social media, in other words, to the so-called subversive media, but it's coming even into mainstream media now. They are in fact compelled to acknowledge that this whole set of policies were adopted even before even COVID-19 appeared, because the whole idea was that society had to make a radical shift from the way it had been operating for the last, say, 70 years, from the Second World War, after the Second World War, and we had to create a new society which was essentially ruled by long-distance communications, by remote control technologies, by new medical processes, including compulsory vaccinations. And all sorts of things were considered to be part of this global reset, which would enable society to move out of the current economic and environmental crisis. And you don't have to believe me on this. You just have to look, for example, at the Nexus magazine, which was published in both English and French in the March of 2019, or several months before COVID-19 appeared in China. And you already find in that magazine a very detailed description of what was being planned, which included compulsory vaccinations, as well as the shift towards remote methods of working, in other words, computer-mediated communications and work, telework, or what we call now, what we are doing right now. In other words, you can see the boom of media like Zoom and Skype, which were not very much used until the pandemic appeared. And suddenly there was this shift towards working from home and avoiding both means of transportation and personal meetings, I mean, meetings in person. So that was part of the plan, which was discussed at Davos. And the Davos Forum published that book, The Great Reset, which pretty much spells out what we are going through, which is essentially a much more totalitarian version of society controlled by technocrats and bureaucrats who basically will tell us where we should go, how much we should eat, where we should live, etc., etc. That's pretty much the kind of world that we're coming into.
You made a very, very valid point here, because this is exactly what we are seeing. And the technocrats, and like we already know how few corporations own majority of the world's companies today, the large corporates. And we also see the military alliances being made. So do you think the AUKUS was made, Australia, US, UK, and Canada? And so this was AUKUS was made. Do you think that and see, we've always seen the European powers leading their own guild. Dutch had their own guild, French had their own guild, and all groupings were individualistic oriented. Now this one is Britain here. And AUKUS, even though they've included US, but include US is not the major partner. The brain is UK over there. So do you think the French will also come up with such kind of plans as part of the Great Reset that you're talking about?
Well, that's part of the European Union's project, because the European Union guides the policies of all European member states and even of neighboring states which are not members, which are highly dependent on the EU. So under the EU plan, states are becoming mere provinces or more or less like American states, states of the United States of America. And major control is being vested into the European institutions, the European Commission, the European Council of Ministers, the European Central Bank. These are institutions that are non-elected, and they operate on the basis of technocracy and of homogenizing, unifying rules. And their calling, their mission is to undermine and weaken national states so that they are behaving only as sort of agents of the supranational European entity. Of course, the wider plan is to eventually bring the whole world together under a single administration, which is to be a sort of a consortium between North American states, that is, of course, US, Canada, and European states, West European states, including Britain. And that would be the global leadership, which in fact was created after World War II, but it existed even before then, because even before then, the great European colonial powers and the United States were the dominant nations. And of course, now we are looking at something much more supranational. But as usual with such plans, whether we like them or not, whether we approve of them or not, the fact is that they always create opposition. And we have seen the opposition rising with Russia, China, Iran, and more states, which do not like the idea of becoming vassals or remaining vassals to this self-appointed global elite. So that's the kind of transition we are living in now, with an increasing prospect of major conflict, including military conflict.
No, developing countries so far, the blur between the first world and the third world has really reduced a lot with the rampant, the modernization, or using the economic principles which everyone has used, capitalistic models. And developing countries have also come up like anything. But there is a bigger poverty amongst the developed nations also, first world nations. Like, for example, I can only quote US here because I live here, that the poverty rates have exponentially increased. The poverty standards may be different, but the poverty rates have exponentially increased. I was seeing the last statistics. Somebody was telling me it is almost 21%. And I've been very, very, uh, I'm very conservative in the numbers right now. But the unofficial numbers are 36.8%, almost reaching 40%. But the official are 21% and between 13.5 to 21%. That's the official rate. Now, if you compare that with countries like India, which has totally exposed, they cannot hide the data because there are more international organizations operating in India than the Indian organizations collecting those facts. So the reported in India's official reported by the Western countries are reported India's poverty rate as 11.8%, which is very high number given the population of India in terms of absolute number. But in terms of percentage of population, it is much lesser, less than half of what the USA is facing today. And I'm sure Europe has a similar number. So the balance, the strategic balance, I think, is shifting to some extent. So what is your view on that?
It's a very wide issue. If you look at the evolution of the economy, it has been going in the direction of concentration of wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. By the way, this is a law of politics which was enunciated by somebody called Mitchells, and it's called the iron law of political power, which essentially stipulates or states that power always gets concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. In the beginning, you may have a large group sharing power, then you have a smaller group, and then a smaller group, and eventually you have probably one dictator and very few people around him, until, of course, he and his cohorts are overthrown and somebody else takes over. Now, these are cycles. And of course, we are in the process of concentration of wealth. You know, looking at hard figures, in the last 2 years, since the pandemic began, $3.8 trillion have been moved into the hands of relatively few multi-billionaires. And the middle class, especially the lower middle classes, have been generally very badly hit, in some cases devastated. But even if they haven't been devastated yet, they have suffered and they have lost a lot of their purchasing power. So what you see is very clearly a concentration of power into fewer hands. And we have seen this many times in history all over the world. It happened, for example, when the feudal age came into being in Europe. It happened, again, I could cite many historical examples. But basically what we are going towards is a new form of feudalism. You might call it techno-feudalism, where people who control such power with so much money, like Bill Gates or Zuckerberg, or you can mention quite a few of these names, they naturally essentially end up owning people who need in some way to support themselves and have to make any kind of sacrifice and concession to be able to survive. So that's what the hard situation is. And on the other hand, if you look at countries like China and India, where you see, again, huge concentrations of wealth into few hands, but all in all, an improvement in the economic situation of the vast majority of the people. This is truer in China so far than it is in India, because the systems are different and naturally the results are also different. So it is true that the countries that will eventually take over are the countries where there is a wider prosperity. In other words, where prosperity is more widely spread. Whereas the countries that have reached an extreme of concentration of wealth will eventually collapse, because beyond a point, an extreme inequality is not sustainable. It can last. I'm quite aware that very, very unequal and unfair systems have lasted for decades, possibly even in centuries. But in today's age, with the fast communications and practically instant interactions between people, it's not likely to last for very long. Eventually, you will see a breakdown and a collapse with a new order forming. but that will take time, and it will be probably very violent and painful, because that's what history teaches us.
No, you clearly said the next phase will be military, because the first phase is the informational control, and people, the common modus operandi throughout the history is separate the people, and then it is easier to target. It's called, simply called, divide and rule. So by putting people in the boxes like what we are sitting right now, digital boxes, and then controlling is very easy. The moment Zoom gets shut off, we both are disconnected immediately, and then communication becomes difficult, and it is easier to control through any other social media app nowadays. Everyone is easily searchable and commonly available. So the next phase you mentioned is a military conflict. And we have seen World War One, World War Two, both have originated from the Western Hemisphere, and it has spread all over the world. W- According to you, what do you think will be again happening again to the whole world?
First, I'd like to say that we are going towards a situation which is being envisioned as an experiment. I mean, it's more than an experiment because it's expected to succeed. It has been rehearsed and planned for quite a few years. And the end result is to be a complete digitization of not only the economy, but of society. In concrete terms, what this means is that there will be a single identity that will be a digital identity for every person. And we already see that with regard to animals, to cattle, for example, where every head of cattle has to be chipped and recorded. And the same is true for for pets like cats and dogs and all. We are coming to a point of digitization of all living beings. And it's moving in the same direction for human beings. And at that point, what you will see is a conversion or a fusion between all the systems which are already working in synergy in advanced societies: the healthcare system, the financial system, the monetary system, the employment system, including retirement. All those things are being concentrated into one system, which essentially will have control over everyone, because any aspect of your life and identity will impinge upon other aspects in terms of your credit card record, if you know what I mean. For example, if you are sick, then that will become known to the people who are in charge of healthcare, but also people in charge of employment, and likewise in charge of the economy, etc., etc. And the same will apply to respect of the laws and rules in place, as is already the case in China. So essentially a credit system that you have to behave by certain standards, you have to do certain things, you have to not do certain other things. It is all kept on your record, and you can be accordingly penalized. For example, if you have not fulfilled a certain requirement, such as getting a mandatory vaccination, then your credit system can be discontinued. And since money will be electronic, you can be deprived of access to your own account. So all that is very thoroughly investigated and discussed. And it is definitely part of the plan, which is to come into being in the next 5, 6, 10 years. And the pandemic management system is already a sort of a prelude to this. It's part of the experimentation process. And this is not so hidden. It is quite open. And of course, those who don't want to upset the majority will say, no, it's all conspiracy. But obviously, if you go a little beyond hearing what somebody says on TV, then you will realize that it's very much part of the plan. Now, what that means is obviously that there will be a lot of constraints that will be used to try to force people into the system, because many of them will not agree. Many will agree and think it's wonderful, but others will just suspect it and decide it's not for them. So the question is, how will that be accepted? Will it lead to massive revolts? I have friends such as, people who are not friends, but whom I respect, like the famous economist Armstrong, who says that there will be a global revolution. It will be something we haven't seen before because it means people will rise against their governments all over the world. And that is probably coming very soon. Now, will they be able to essentially prevent that? And would an international war be a way to avoid that? That may be the reason why the tensions are rising over Ukraine, and possibly, for example, about Taiwan in the South China Sea. Would it be a reason or a pretext to say, to keep social order at home by saying we have to fight the Russians and the Chinese, and therefore, since we're at war, everybody should behave themselves. And we have to impose certain rules because we all know that the first thing that is affected in a war is social freedom. I mean, people are put under severe restrictions because the nation's life is at stake. So is that what we are going to see? I don't know. I think prophecies are being made in all directions. Many people think we're not going to avoid a major war, which might take place in Europe or which might take place in the South Pacific, or maybe in both. Because the way things are now is that a war tends to spread. We have seen the last two world wars that did not remain confined to any continent. They spread all over the world. And today we are much more globally integrated than we used to be then. So most likely, if there is a war on one theater, it will spread to other theaters.
Various reports keep coming out and about Africa, and it's the Asian century, and but we have not seen any initiatives by the African nations or even the Asian countries, including, see, countries like India, which has a large population, and China, are naturally going to come to the prominence because of their large populations. Nobody can avoid them. Combined, both of them are 1/3 of the world population. And but African nations, South American countries, and these are the countries which have always been on the colonial backside historically. So do you think that there is a plan on, I don't see their leaders coming into prominence. They rely on United Nations, and we all know United Nations who runs it. So do you think that they will have a resurgence of any sort in this new changing world order?
There is already a resurgence of some kind taking place in many countries. Of course, many of them have their own domestic problems, which are so big that they cannot look very much outside. In fact, I'm surprised how sort of locally focused people are. I mean, when I'm in France, I notice how little is known or discussed about the rest of the world. France, even within the European Union, lives in a very self-contained and almost autistic perspective, if I may be allowed to use that term. Basically, nothing important happens outside of France. If you listen to the media or if you talk to people, it's rare to hear anybody making an informed, in-depth comment about what's happening, say, in another country. China is getting a little more attention now because of its sheer weight and influence. But other than that, it's very much about what's happening here, and we only hear people who belong to our country and who speak our own language and who are somewhat familiar because of their official positions. So it becomes despite the claim of being universalistic and global, actually, we are all living in villages and very self-centered villages. So I have my doubts that there will be such a, global awareness in many people. Global awareness is the feature of few individuals, relatively speaking. In Africa, I think people are again too focused on their own personal problems and on trying to build better states or at least better communities to look very far away. South America is interesting because there is a philosophical tradition and there is an old debate about how to how to get free from colonial influence, the new colonial influence, and particularly the American influence and now the Chinese influence, which is in a way trying to overthrow the American hegemony in South America and Latin America. So there is a very lively debate, especially in countries that have gone through their own sort of revolution, like Venezuela or Chile or Mexico and Argentina, Brazil. So naturally, I don't know how much these countries will be able to influence what's going on in the world, but considering that they have considerable resources and relatively fewer people in terms of size of population, I think there are, for example, many people are taking refuge in some of those countries because they feel they'll be safer if the world economy collapses and if you get a massive international conflict, which could devastate a number of advanced societies.
Recently, you mentioned China. Recently, a statement came out of China, and it was very widely circulated in Indian media, but not in the American media, that we have learned well from USA, and we will not fall like USSR. They said it, and I somehow agree with them because they are a good. They copy very well sometimes. Not all the things. I mean, they are trying to copy the aircrafts for many years, but not able to do it. But they are a good follower, I would say. That if they what they have done with other things in technology space, especially artificial intelligence, is very remarkable. And so, giving their due respect of what they have done good. But the Chinese have also managed to buy influence through their money. They have used their money pretty well in international diplomacy in terms of using the same colonial mindsets which actually people fought independence from. They have used it again and made so many countries indebted to them. Now, all the countries know that, including US is indebted to them, and France and European countries are also indebted to them. France is somewhat more independent because of their models or whatever, but the Eastern Europe is completely dependent on them, and Central Europe is dependent on them, including Germany, cannot sustain without them. So, do you think that Chinese will have a major play in the new world order?
The Chinese have been trying to move ahead of others in the very concept that I have been evoking, in other words, a fully digitized, robotized society. And they have gone faster than others in creating the digital currency, which is about to come into play. In fact, it's already there, but it's going to become, on the scale of China and its trade partners, it's going to become more and more dominant. And therefore, as far as also social credit system, ranking people according to their behavior and to their reliability and their discipline, all that is going on. And of course, it's both admired and reviled abroad because it gives the image of a very controlling society, of a society where the individual is only a cog in the wheel and the individual doesn't count. And of course, what the Chinese have called capitalism with Chinese characteristics, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, which comes to about the same thing, is basically that fusion of capitalism and communism, which, let's face it, has been attempted before. Germany under the Third Reich did that. It adopted some of the features of capitalism and some of the features of socialism, and it brought the two together. Let's not forget that the Nazis were National Socialists. Of course, later on, they became defined as far-right people, but it's not entirely clear they were far-right because they actually were quite opposed to some of the traditional right elements, such as the aristocracy in Germany. Of course, they made a very good partnership with the big business because they found mutual benefit. But basically, what you are seeing is a return to some of those formulas, because we all know that a sort of state-run, you might say, totalitarian society, which uses certain elements of capitalism, is a formidably effective machine. I'm not saying it's effective for everybody's happiness and freedom, but it produces results. And China is producing such amazing results that the whole world is now beginning to say, well, maybe we should be more like them. This is very clear among European politicians who are now grudgingly admiring China and saying maybe we should pick some of their formulas because otherwise we cannot win against them. And we all see that basically the United States on many terrains is being defeated by China. Why? Because the American system is no longer working. I mean, it's not working optimally, and especially in states that have adopted the so-called liberal, extreme liberal, so-called woke policy rules. The economy has become less and less efficient. And therefore, you have more and more poverty, more and more disunity, more and more anger, more and more division between people. And when a nation breaks down because people hate each other, it can no longer compete with any other nation. In fact, it's practically lost. So the Chinese have been able to learn that lesson. We don't know how long their heyday will last, but right now they are, of course, making hay while the sun shines. I mean, clearly they are going everywhere and taking over whatever they can, and they can take over more and more things because, frankly, they are finding a void everywhere they go. The fact is that if you look at Africa, if you look at South America, they are ready for a Chinese takeover, if I might say so, simply because nothing else is happening right now. The Chinese are the only ones who are able to deliver goods and do it in a way which benefits, at least short term, the people who have an influence there and even the wider masses.
And I think they have done it very smartly. And Russia is being piggybacking on China to a large extent because of the fear of sanctions from the West, especially Americans. And the media, American media, targets Russia a lot more than China in terms of political and military escape. So do you think Russia will have a new play in this new world order, or Russia will be aligned with the West?
You see, we all know that systems are important, but then we all know that systems are only as good as the people who run them. Even a good system, if it's run by mediocre people, will become less and less effective. In the case of Russia, the great luck they have for the last 20 years is that Putin is an exceptionally able, intelligent, and learned man. And that's probably why he's disliked so much by a lot of leaders in the West who are not so either intelligent, learned, or competent. I'm sorry to say this, but this is what we're seeing in the West. And I'm not singling out the United States. Europe is also led by very mediocre people on average. So Putin is outstanding. Whether we agree with his goals or not is another matter. But we have to admit that his achievement rate is astounding. I mean, to keep a country basically behind him after it has gone through such tremendous turmoil, when he was able to build it back up and make it into today's leading power, at least strategically, not economically, but strategically, that is a magnificent achievement. And I think Putin will remain as one of the great leaders of this century. The question is now, what will he do with that? I think he's playing a very clever game. He's basically pushing the Americans and the Europeans into a corner, saying enough of this NATO supremacy. We are not going to accept to play second fiddle to you. You have to deal with us as equals. Just like you have the European Union and America has its bases and network of allies and dependents and vassals, we have our own sphere of influence with our traditional, allies, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. And we are going to make sure that this is our turf and you don't get into it and you don't threaten us with nuclear weapons. So you have to accept it. And if you don't accept it, you are going to run into a lot of trouble because we can cut off the gas supply. As far as Europe is concerned, they depend largely on Russian gas now. And we can give you all sorts of other problems. So you better come you sit down and you make a deal with us, which is equal and which we can live with and where we all feel safe. And of course, the Americans have been dancing around and jumping around and saying, no, we don't want to do that because we are superior and we cannot commit to anything. We are not used to making commitments. We want to be free to do whatever we want at any time. But now it's becoming harder and harder because the Europeans are suffering and even the Americans don't know what to do. And you have to see how much Blinken is now pleading with the Russians to please not push things too far and please be reasonable, simply because America, frankly, wouldn't know what to do if the Russians for example, took over the Ukraine, which they probably could do within 48 hours. And at that point, there would be a lot of shouting in Europe and America, but not too much more would happen, except for sanctions, which have already been trying and which don't work. Russia is already prepared for that. And China, in that sense, will back Russia. So, when we are dealing with that kind of scenario, we realize that the Europeans and the Americans have been bluffing their way for the last 10, 20 years, but they are no longer able to do what they could do in the past and what they still claim to be able to do now. So the world has changed. They have to adjust to it. And there is no point repeating every 5 minutes that you are the only superpower, because frankly, if you can't deliver, you have to reconcile yourself to a new situation. And I think that's a lesson we are learning. And Russia and China are teaching us that lesson, whether we like it or not. And obviously, lessons are not liked because they sometimes tell us the truth we don't want to hear.
It is very, detailed. I think your viewpoints are, I would say, very revealing. And I am practically not a very good student of international diplomacy. The last thing I would like to say is there is a demand by countries like India, Brazil, and large land masses, large governments, to become the UN Security Council permanent member. Do you think it's still a relevant demand? Because UN Security Council itself is a World War II relic.
Yes, it is. You're right. And I have always said, and mind you, I'm not claiming special authority or knowledge on this, but I'm just echoing what has said by people much more qualified than I, that the Security Council can probably never be reformed in a meaningful way. Why? Because it is a system that was precisely created by the winners of World War II for essentially locking their predominance. So it's not in the nature of things that anybody would give up its predominance, even if it becomes a fictional one. For example, which permanent member of the Security Council is going to give up its membership or want other members to come in and get the veto power? They have no reason to do that. It would be committing harakiri as far as their own electorates are concerned. For example, France keeps making noises about the Europe having more, so because Europe is being criticized for having 2 seats in the Security Council when it no longer has such a power over the world. Therefore, France is being told by Germany, why don't you share your seat with us? Because Germany is a greater economic power than France now. And therefore, we deserve to be part of the Security Council. And if we can get an independent seat of our own, then you should share yours with us. And of course, the French would never do that, just like the British would never give up their seat in favor of anybody else. So the question is, if you add too many new members of the Security Council as permanent members, you will dilute the Security Council, and the existing permanent members will not like to have new people who come in who will make their own job more difficult. Therefore, it seems to me that probably the Security Council will have to be disassembled completely and something new built, because it cannot really be meaningfully reformed. And that's why we have seen growing emphasis being put on G20 and other such organizations, because they provide a new opportunity for upcoming countries such as India to play a bigger role. Otherwise, we all see how many proposals have been made for the last 30 years and how they have all been defeated. If India says, I want to be a member, Pakistan says, no, there should be a rotating membership from all South Asian countries. If Brazil wants to be a member, Argentina says, no, we also want to be, or else it should be a common seat for South American countries, and so on and so forth, and every country will oppose others. There were these 4 countries, Japan, Germany, India, and Brazil, which made a sort of a joint application. And all 4 of them were essentially turned down because there were too many regional rivals which didn't like them, saying, no, China said, I don't want Japan under any circumstances, nor do I really want India either. And likewise, South American countries outside Brazil didn't want Brazil to be the sole representative of Latin America. So it's a system which probably cannot survive the era that we have been living so far, which is now ending, which is the era of post-World War II, United Nations, which means the United Nations against Germany, Japan, and Italy. They are the ones who essentially build the United Nations.
Thank you so much, Mr. Carpentier, and for your views. And what a wonderful program this is. I have so many questions coming online right now, but due to the shortage of time, I'm going to avoid those questions. So do ask on YouTube on the comment section. We will definitely try to answer. And come if you see those comments, then please answer over there. Thank you so much for watching.
I don't think I see the comments, sorry, but I guess you will send them to me or something like that.
No, I'll send you the link and then you can see all the comments. And
all right.
Thank you all for watching, and thank you all for being aware and so early in the morning. Namaste and see you later. Bye.
Namaste. Thank you.